To begin, my part of the conversation is I want to share with you some excerpts from the editor's desk of the January 7th issue of Christian Century, which was focused on when a congregation dies. Maybe some of you subscribed to this or had seen it. Two excellent articles on this matter, but I was really drawn to the John Buchanan editor's desk column. He always has something up front which relates to what the particular major articles are about. And I would like to share with you some of his words on what the church is made of. This is perhaps to provide a certain theological grounding for the conversation. He begins by quoting Frederick Buechner, some of you may have heard of him, from a chapter in his book called Secrets in the Dark, and the chapter is entitled The Church. Jesus made his church out of human beings with more or less the same mixture in them of cowardice and guts, intelligence and stupidity, of selfishness and generosity, of openness of heart and sheer cussedness, as you would be apt to find in any one of us. The reason he made his church out of human beings is that human beings were all there was to make it out of. In fact, as far as I know, human beings are all there is to make it out of still. Maybe the best thing that could happen to the church would be for some great tidal wave of history to wash it all away. The church buildings tumbling, the church money all lost, the church bulletins blowing through the air like dead leaves, the differences between preachers and congregations all lost too. Then all we would have left would be each other and Christ, which was all there was in the first place. At the present time, throughout the United States, there are about 9 churches closing their doors for good almost every day. John Buchanan goes on to say, there's a monumental amount of hand-wringing and blame that goes with all of this. I'm convinced that our energy would be better spent on dealing honestly with the realities we face. We are holding on to a model of church that doesn't work for everybody in every place. Small, aging congregations are trying desperately to raise enough money to fix the roof of a crumbling building and to pay a full-time clergy person. Yes, there are large urban and suburban churches that are thriving and growing, but many neighborhood and rural congregations require courageous new thinking if they are to survive. New thinking on the part of denominational executives, pastors and priests brave enough to walk into challenging situations, and people, especially lay people, willing to let go of a church model that no longer works.
I've got a couple of pieces I want to share. The first is some summary slides from about 15 years of experience in reconfiguration of congregations. We've got a fairly extensive best practices document that we work with our reconfiguration team, a team of 9 very gifted lay people who work with me directly with congregations. And so this is part of our accumulated wisdom from a bunch of years of doing this stuff. One of the really critical things is to realize that this is not a new phenomenon. The Diocese of Toronto has reconfigured, closed, amalgamated, transformed into new ministry uses over 170 congregations since 1898. We've planted over 400 churches in the history of the diocese. We currently have about 215. What happened to those other places? Things changed. Life changed. The demographics of the neighborhood changed. Mission that was originally quite clear was no longer tenable. So the vast majority of these, we have stories of villages that no longer exist. The last thing there was the church, and it's now closed. Areas in the downtown core where no one lives because it's all financial district, and the church that was there didn't have a mission field anymore, so it closed. It's actually a community center now. So, one of the things is that we've identified that there are two clear streams that are followed when we've got a reconfiguration going on. The first is crisis-driven. That's where they've waited too long. The crisis, they've hit the wall, it's usually financial. And it's the decision to reconfigure is driven by the recognition of the parish is in a state it's not going to recover from. And this is usually imposed from the diocese, from the Treasury Board, from the bishop's office, something like that. The second one, the mission-driven reconfiguration, is more about naming the moment. The congregation recognizes that they're facing sustainability issues down the road, and they want to do something about it because they're still committed to the mission of the church. The decision to end the current configuration of their ministry is understood in the second one in terms of mission. I won't make you guess which one I prefer working with. Suffice to say that we have almost no crisis-driven reconfigurations anymore. They're all driven by mission. And that's because of a long strategic planning process, and I'll share a little bit of that in a minute. One of the critical learnings is that in both cases, unanimity and clarity of message by all parties involved is critical. One of the things you'll find is when parishes are going through reconfigurations, if they don't like what they're hearing from me, they'll call the area bishop's office and see if they can get a different opinion out of him, or the finance committee, or the social justice guy. So everybody needs to be on the same page, because what we're doing is part of the mission of the whole church, not just of a local congregation. A number of years ago, back around 2002, we developed a policy. It was originally supposed to be a viability policy, but we didn't like that word. So we developed what became called the Sustainable and Strategic Ministry Policy. And it talks about congregational sustainability in terms of a dialogue between two realities. The first axis is mission, and the second one doesn't want to work. There we go. Oh, now it's doing everything. Just a second. The second one is resource. So on the mission continuum, at the positive end, we have congregations that are able to articulate and demonstrate a vital mission and ministry that's appropriate to their context, right? They're doing what God's calling them to do where they've been planted. At the other end, we've got parishes that are kind of fuzzy on mission, really fuzzy on mission. They become very inward-looking and maintenance-focused. Every parish, every congregation can be graphed somewhere on that line. Then we have resources. At the top end, we've got the parishes that have the resources, the people, the building, the spiritual health, the money. It's not just money. I do this all the time. The Brits took this and they changed it. They took resource out and they just talk about money. I know lots of rich parishes that lack the spiritual health that they need to do mission. So, it's resources. At the bottom end, we got parishes that lack some resource. That creates four quadrants, and the four quadrants are the parishes, the types of parishes that are provided for in our policy. So you've got a mission and ministry appropriate to your context, and you have the resources to do it. Go do it. You're sustainable. I mean, ideally, I'd like to sit here and show you a map of the diocese where all our parishes were sustainable. Then we know the kingdom of God has come on earth. The other side, lacking a sustainable mission, lacking the resources to carry it out, you're unsustainable. Parishes that have resources to keep going, but aren't really clear on their mission, we call static. And the final definition, ministries and parishes, congregations that have a clear mission and ministry but lack the resources are potentially strategic. I say potentially because a parish can't self-designate. The designation of ministries under the policy is under the province of our area bishops in consultation with their area councils and regional deans. Otherwise, every unsustainable parish would suddenly discover how strategic it was, right? And one of the things about being strategic is you have a right, we are a Catholic church, you have a right to call upon the wider church for support in carrying out that mission. And the policy says that the rest of the church has a duty to prayerfully consider that. So part of the strategy that we've been following is, as we've been closing and amalgamating unsustainable churches, the money that the stored faithfulness, as my stewardship colleague calls it, that is contained in that real estate is liberated for use in supporting strategic ministry. And we have about $30 million, I think, that we've liberated over the last 10, 15 years. And 20% of that money goes into supporting soft costs, ministry soft costs, new staffing, new configurations in parishes. 70% is available for real estate work, whether we need to buy a new piece of property or build a new building. We opened about a year and a half ago a brand new $6 million church, which was a merger of 4 congregations. And they started life, we consecrated it the day we opened it because it was debt-free. It was paid for from the sale of 3 of their 4 buildings. So what we do with this is we sit down every 2 years or so with the bishop and the regional deans, and we map every parish in the diocese. And it's really amazing when you get a big map up on the wall and you start to put the points up, you start to see things like how close churches are or how close churches aren't. So we have parishes, for instance, in some of the rural areas, which have been designated as strategic simply because they're the last church we got for miles, okay? So we need to support them. One of the things they probably need is some help financially and some help with mission focus. This is just a quick example. This is the city of Brampton up near the airport in Toronto. 5 churches. It's an area that's grown. The city has tripled in size in the last 25 years, but we haven't built any new churches. And the ones we got, well, you can see we got 2 yellow ones that are static and 1 red, unsustainable one, St. James, and then 2 sustainable parishes. So we're engaged right now in a conversation with the people at St. James, looking at eventually walking them up the road to Christchurch and merging them and bringing their resources and assets so that they're better able to manage ministry. And hopefully moving St. Jude's and Holy Family into a more sustainable vision. We currently have about 26 red dots on our map, 25, we closed one. And those churches will likely be closed within 2 years, possibly 3. We have 51 yellow, 46 strategic, orange ones, 83 green. That's the good news. And then we have this, being Anglicans, we have to modify every policy we have, right? So we have 5th type now. We call it GORC. It stands for God Only Really Knows. We got some of those, and we're still working it out. A couple of things we've learned in doing this over the past decade and a half. It is really critical when you're doing this to have a top-notch chaplain in role, in place in the congregation. Their job is to tell everybody that even though they're closing or amalgamating, that Jesus still loves them, and it's good, and they're being faithful in doing this. Constantly. Strong pastoral care, but keep the vision in front of the congregation all the time and give them the permission to make difficult decisions. The other thing we have to do is to make sure that they know that this is not a career-limiting move and it's not a failure being the pastor of a parish that's going through an amalgamation or a closure. We need these people to stick with it all the way through in order to have a successful outcome at the end. So we have to address their career the career implications and their livelihood so that when they're done, they've got another position to go to. And lastly, we have to invest a significant amount of time. 2 to 3 units a week is not enough for this role. I mean, I'd really like it to be full-time. Sometimes we're not able to do that, but we need to invest significant amounts of money. And the bottom line is, if you invest in it now, if we have to, we can charge it as a recoverable when we sell the real estate. I mean, one of the things that we're very lucky with is that our dirt's worth a lot compared to some parts of the continent. And so when we sell a church, we have money that we can recover expenses from. The other critical thing is, like I said before, there must be a consistency in the message from the diocese, from the bishop, from the clergy, from the staff. Care must be taken with the media and and community relationships. I think Daniel's going to say a little bit more about that. The other critical piece is, one of the things we learned is you got to watch the meddlers, okay? The sainted rector who's been retired for 20 years, but who rides in on his white horse to save his legacy, you know? You need a diocesan assassin for those guys. And it's critical to remember that this is a grief process. And we know how to do grief. You know, most of us are trained. You know, how many of us read Elizabeth Kubler-Ross until we were, you know, yeah. Anxiety, fear, and emotional reaction can be overwhelming. And this will prevent progress until it's alleviated. These things take time. You can't rush it. You can't let the accountants drive the process. Sorry, Steve, I didn't mean to insult accountants. The really critical thing is it's all about narrative. It's all about story. You got to find a way to honor the stories of the community so that they feel heard and cared for. We actually have done some work recording timelines, recording oral narratives of stories, and preserving them for posterity. Stories of past reconfigurations are vital. Whoa, I don't know what happened there. To enable conversations to begin and continue. We tell them the stories of other congregations that have done this and what's come out of it. So, that's a little bit about the on-the-ground practicalities of closing and amalgamating churches. A couple of weeks ago, I was privileged to be part of a gathering in the UK, where there's some major research been going on around parish health, parish missions, reconfigurations, sizes of churches, all this kind of stuff. And I love this quote. This is a guy by the name of David Wasdell who wrote a report in 1974 called Let My People Grow. It was a General Synod report. He said, "We have become involved in the public reenactment of a heresy. We believe and proclaim a gospel of grace available to all, but we operate a structure which takes the form of a club with limited membership." That sound familiar? And I'm cutting out a whole whack of slides. Some of this material is becoming available in the Church of England now, and I ask you to check it out. One of the things that George Lings, the presenter of most of this material, one of the things that he did really well was to outline the problem and then provide some analysis that I'm going to share with you now about what the box looks like. You know, we always talk about thinking outside the box. That one's kind of messed up, isn't it? You know, what's the box? You know, there are good reasons to stay in the box, and we've heard a bunch of that. I mean, I think Marlon yesterday talked a lot about the kind of pressures that the organization brings to bear when you get outside the box, right? So we keep talking about thinking outside the box. What's the box? This was great. This is George Ling's work. The first piece of the box is our church building. That's the floor. The second one is our worship service on Sunday. You know, that's when we do worship. Our priest. And lastly, by the way, you need to come to us, right? That's our box. This is the way we've been doing it for 2,000 years, right? The result is they've found pretty consistently that there's a ceiling in this kind of model for about 175 average weekly attendance. We know that. That's the Alban Institute stuff all over again. In rural and poor urban areas, the ceiling is a lot lower in Britain. I imagine here too. But it's not just a box. It's more like a blockhouse or a fortress. Those walls are really thick, right? The first wall is the traditional training and local expectations around the clergy. So first of all, the clergy are all trained to maintain that box, right? That's what the seminaries form them to do. And if they ever get outside that box, the local parish board, the vestry, whatever, is going to yank them back pretty fast. Local expectations. Hey, we're paying your salary. You're going to do this the way we say. And one of the things you're going to do is maintain Sunday worship just the way we like it, because we're the ones that are here and we're paying the bills. So that wall, liturgical conservatism, preserves the Sunday worship wall. Then we have the church building. You ever tried to say you were going to change a historic building? The local public and heritage lobby will be all over you like flies to you know what. Internal and external pressures to keep that perfect church. And I got to tell you, I've seen some really ugly churches that people deeply love. I have some salt shakers with a picture of Church of the Epiphany, Scarborough on it. I think the guy was a failed designer of medical centers. The last one is the parish boundaries. And in Britain, this is a very big thing because you're not allowed to cross parish boundaries, right? So you're supposed to go to the church in your village, period, full stop. And if someone is seen to be recruiting you into their parish, that's really bad. That's poaching. We have parish boundaries too. We have all kinds of barriers to going out and reaching people who we're not otherwise reaching, who may even be in our community. It might be language, it might be class, it might be any number of things. So we have these thick walls, but the walls are braced internally. This is a really tough structure. The first cross brace is a clergy and people client-provider collusion. It's that you're trained traditionally, we expect you to maintain the tradition, and by the way, the tradition is we have Eucharist every Sunday, and you're going to do it at 11 o'clock, period, full stop. This bracket, because it's a proper church. It looks like a church, it has Gothic windows, and it has a pointy thing with a cross on it, and by the way, we do Eucharist every Sunday at 11 o'clock. You'd love our church. Whoops, this thing's going crazy again. You'd love our church. We love it. The folks in the public lobby, the heritage lobby, they love it, and it's our local geographical parish. You'd love it. And then the whole issue of poachers, not allowing you to bring people in from other than the group that's already there, right? So the result is nothing changes. And if anything does change, the system colludes to yank you back pretty fast. So, how do we get beyond the box? This is the really brilliant piece, I think. And this comes from a lot of research that they've done around the Fresh Expressions and missional movement in England. Church says the first thing is to bust through that clergy ceiling, we've got to really invest in pioneer clergy. That's something that the Brits are very big on. They have a number of new seminaries that have evolved to provide clergy with training to get out of the buildings and to go out and to build Christian communities outside of churches. And they really realize that lay discipleship is the critical key ingredient that they're really missing right now. That the most effective missional communities are lay-led, as in not lay professionals, lay, right? And we're going to come to you. You don't have to come to us. Our pioneers, our lay-led mission is coming to you. We're going to go to where you gather. So whether that's the pub or the sports field or whatever, we're going to come to you. And lastly, we're not building communities anymore around liturgy. Liturgy will come. Liturgy is important, but that's not where we're going to start. We're going to start with Jesus. We're going to build communities around Jesus. And that is how they're beginning to conceive how we get out of our litter box, all right? There's a whole concept of multiplication being, we need to do this and we need a model. We need to follow the same model, cookie cutter. That's not what they're saying. The model that they're talking about, this thing is driving me crazy, is about non-identical reproduction. It's organic. So your parish church is the parent. And the parent needs to nurture their children from infancy through adolescence into releasing them. And they don't have to look like us. They don't have to act like us for us to love them and for us to be their parents and for them to be our kids. Can we risk, where's that question? Will we dare to go with a messy, non-identical future to allow the creation of many more young churches. This is what I think is critical to the amalgamation work that we're doing, because we can't just bring together 4 sick, dying congregations and put them together without also doing the work around busting out of the box. Because otherwise, all we'll end up with is a larger, sick, dying congregation, and in 5 years, I'm going to be back there trying to merge them with somebody else who's sick and dying. And I think the big thing is that the why that Marlon kept talking about, I keep hearing that all over the church now. The why is about a reclaiming of mission. Mission is how God loves the world, and the only means God has to carry mission out is us. And it's the local parish that we understand is how mission is carried out. That's where the rubber hits the road. That's the rock face. So, just some crazy random thoughts. And I forgot to bring any business cards. I don't have any in my briefcase, so there's my email address. And a couple of, the anecdote to evidence report is probably the best thing that's been written on the whole understanding of mission and its impact on local parishes. There you go.
It's a blessing and a curse to work for Bishop Eugene Sutton. He has publicly said that since his consecration in 2008, that he fully expects that by the time he retires, which he expected would be at least 10 years if God grants him so much that time, that he started with a diocese that had 115 congregations, and he expected that by the time he left, there would be 90. But he expected that there would be more Episcopalians in that diocese. So that was one of the reasons why he created a position of canon for evangelism and ministry development. And so I'm the evangelist. And I was supposed to grow this church, and that became one of our 5 goals and mission of our first strategic plan of the diocese was to increase our average Sunday attendance by 10% within 5 years. We will not see that. That won't happen. But we are growing. We are one of the dioceses that was listed recently in the National Church as being one of those who are growing, and so that's a good thing. But we have, in the last 5 years, in my time there, we have addressed congregations numbering close to 10 that have either closed or drastically reduced their presence or left the Episcopal Church or are in a meeting next Tuesday, meeting with a warden of a congregation that we're going to start planning that ending process so that they can close. So I just want to point out and make sure that you understand that what you can expect in this process is a great deal of pain, a lot of emotion. There are people who will react irrationally, and I'm hoping that we're going to hear from Angel Scarborough, whose first job after ordination was to close a congregation. So it is a time that is fraught with a lot of angst. You're going to lose people. People will leave. No matter how good you plan it, no matter how good you prepare the people for what's coming, no matter what you do, you will lose people. They will leave the Episcopal Church, or they will go to another congregation. You will lose people. And yet, there have been times when we have spoken to congregations that were closing. In our diocese, we have a canon, a local canon, that allows the standing committee to imperil a parish. And we've used it, I think, 4 or 5 times in the last 5 years, right, Scott? And And there have actually been times where either the bishop or Scott or both have gone in and said, we really need to close this parish. And there would be a sense of relief on the part of some of the people, because they know now that they no longer have to worry that BG&E is going to shut off the electricity. They don't have to worry about that. It's not their problem anymore. It's our problem. But it's amazing how you'll see that whole spectrum of emotion in this process, because it is difficult. There's no question that it is difficult. You can also expect, in some cases, lawsuits. There was a congregation that existed on the fringe of an area of Baltimore County. I went out to be with them in the closing months. It was very clear that there was no interest in growing the congregation. One of my Sundays that I was there were actually some new people who'd come from this huge apartment complex just down the road, and none of the members wanted to talk to them. They didn't want to talk to those people. They liked their little club. And so it was very clear that that they were not going to do anything to advance their mission, because they didn't have a mission, but they did have waterfront property. So when the Imperiled Parish Canon was instituted and we closed them, we, of course, got a lawsuit from a group claiming to be members, and it's really only one person. But that's now in the courts, and we're waiting to hear which way the judge is going to go on that, and we don't know. But it just adds some bile-producing stuff on the staff. I mean, we have to deal with our lawyer, and we have to deal with their lawyer, and it's just part of the deal. What would we do with the funds from the sale of that property? We could do new mission and new ministry in certain places, and do as the Diocese of Toronto has that quadrant of congregations that are doing mission but don't have the resources. We could add some resources. We also lost two congregations to the Roman Catholic Church, and one of the buildings the congregation bought from us. The other one we were going to keep because it's in a strategic area for us, and it's a huge complex. Well, we're in the process. In fact, the property, we sold some of the property off to a athletic association, a Christian athletic association. And we've been in conversations with a resource-sized congregation about starting a new congregation at the old St. Timothy's in Catonsville, Maryland. Much of the funding of that is going to come from the sale of this property. So I really think that it's kind of a misnomer to call all of this mergers and closings. I think that it's resurrection and new life. Because who would have thought when we had a congregation of, I don't know, maybe 30 on a Sunday in a church that would seat maybe 400 up on Loch Raven Boulevard. And they were one of those who were relieved when we said, you're going to have to close your doors. Who would have thought that it wouldn't be too long after that St. Andrew's Episcopal Church would become St. Andrew's International Christian Community Church, Anglican/Episcopal. Because there was a congregation that moved in there that was headed up by an Anglican priest from Kenya, from the Diocese of Nakuru in Kenya. He'd been in the area for about 10 years. His new bishop instructed him to be in communion with the Episcopal Bishop of Maryland. Now, for any of you who know about the history between many of the African countries, especially Kenya, and the Episcopal Church in the last 10 years or 12 years, we haven't been talking much. And out of that has come a relationship between the Bishop of Maryland and the Bishop of Nakuru, to the point that Bishop Sutton and the Bishop of Nakuru co-presided at an ordination in that building. So it's brought together two parts of the Anglican communion that weren't having much to say to one another for a long time. We don't know where this relationship is going to go. Right now, they're tenants. The bishop is willing to designate them a different kind of worshiping community within the diocese. We haven't figured that out yet. But the building was there. And this congregation needed a new place to worship. And so there they are. There are a lot of opportunities that come out of a change like that. And so this has been a sludge to go through, working with congregations that fight you and don't want to work with you and don't see any kind of resurrection or new life in this. And so it can be difficult. And it can really come under the heading of not a lot of fun. And as I said in this morning's session, pretty much at the end of any given day, I ask myself, Dan, was today a gospel day or was it an institutional day? And that's sort of my examen, to put it in Ignatian terms. That's sort of my examen at the end of each day. Some are institutional days, some are gospel days. But as my friend Dave Robinson pointed out, if it's both, then you're getting a glimpse of the kingdom. And I kind of like that interpretation. If it's both, you're getting a glimpse of the kingdom. And it's been a challenge. I'd like to be doing a lot more evangelism, but I'm doing what presents itself right now. We're being a little too reactive, I think. We need to be a little more proactive. I think that both my colleagues here can teach us in the Diocese of Maryland a lot about how to be more proactive in looking at this. Canon of the Ordinary, Scott Slater, is here, and he has come up with a list that's color-coded, much like your quadrant is. And I think that that's probably a first step in looking at some sort of a proactive way of looking at what we're going to do. But I've also talked to a couple of congregations, as the bishop has, and followed up with what he did in talking to some congregations about starting new missions in certain places or collaborating and doing ministries together. And we've also discovered that sometimes if you just leave congregations alone, they'll start talking about doing ministry together. And we've got a couple of instances in the diocese where that's happening. And so it's a gospel day. Questions, comments, things that you know about in your life, and wait till the microphone comes to you so that it can be recorded, because this is going to probably find its way online sometime. So don't say anything that you don't want anybody to see in Kenya.
Oops.
Or Idaho. Yes, in the back.
Dan, in terms of the publicity, how do you write, how is the story, both of the closing and of the rebirth or emerging, how do you write that? I mean, how is that shared with the wider community, not the outside the church?
Well, that's something you need to be very, very sensitive to when you're working in a situation like this. This is, you have to take into account community relations with the community around, that if something closes, you have to know and be in conversation with the local community. St. Timothy's in Catonsville is a very large piece of property. A lot of the neighbors in the area walk their dogs through there or jog through there, or the athletic fields were part of that community, much like a public park. So we couldn't just go along and just sell it to a developer and put in a bunch of townhomes. I mean, we really have to look at what is going to be best for community relations, public relations, as well as media relations, because we've already had one article about Ascension Middle River, the waterfront property place, that tried to make the Episcopal Church look like this big overarching entity, and these poor little people in Middle River, this working class area community. They've tried to really pit us against them. So you really have to be careful about how you move forward. And you can always put out your message. Whether or not anybody's going to listen to that or not you have no control over that. You do have control over what your message is and what you say and how you say it. And that's always within your power to do that. And that's critical in any kinds of these situations where you have a potential of looking like the big bad guy.
When we're working in process with congregations, at the end of every meeting, we sit down and say, okay, so what are we telling people at coffee hour on Sunday? Everybody has the same message. The consistency of message thing is absolutely critical. So, and it's best if that's coming from the local leadership, from the wardens, from the senior, because those are the folks that the local media are going to talk to. So, it doesn't always work. I have a file of newspaper clippings I'd wish never got written, but in the long run, usually the good side wins out.
I'm curious about how you initiate the conversations between the churches, say in your case when you showed us the chart, like the red dot church and the green dot and yellow and orange, the various colors. Do you go in there telling them, this is what we want, or this is what the diocese thinks would be a good outcome, or do you let them sort of wallow in it for a while? I mean that in the best way too, to see if they can come up with something on their own.
The first step is to do the mapping. And so we begin to see patterns. So on Sunday, in your prayers, if you could remember the parishes of St. David's, St. John's Weston, Church of the Advent, and Church of the Good Shepherd, they're all having membership meetings to vote on an amalgamation, 4 churches into one. They exist in about a 2 square mile area. The largest of them has 65 at worship. Together they'd be about 180. With 225,000 on the plate, but they're spreading out over 4 buildings, and they all know they're not sustainable in their present form. And every time we do one of these, it gets a little easier because we keep telling the stories. So they know about Grace Church on Kennedy Road, 4 churches in 3 miles of road who came together, sold 3 of their buildings. We knocked down the 4th building, built a brand new $6 million state-of-the-art church. They got about 150 people a Sunday now. It's great. They're actually reaching out, doing things. Whereas before, all they could do was scrape together the money to keep the lights on. They couldn't fix the roof. They didn't have the money. So that's the kind of, and the critical piece in our polity being an episcopally led structure, the bishop can say to the 4 churches, hey, we got to have a conversation, I have a good friend who works in the United Church, which is our version in Canada, the Methodist Church. They don't have that authority. Each congregation is its own political entity, and getting them to talk about mergers that make sense is really tough.
In Massachusetts, it's a bit different. We're still in the reactive mode, in my opinion, more than we should be, and we haven't been able to move over to the proactive road. But for the most part, those conversations, sorry, I used the conversation word. I guess I owe somebody $5.
Conversations are okay.
No,
Sorry.
Nope, the D and C word.
Chats.
So,
You had these chats.
Yes.
Chats.
Yes.
Fireside chats.
I call them prayers and ponderings.
Yes.
We do, in our diocese, we use moral suasion, and we use lots of opportunities to have chats. When things become critical and it reaches a certain point where it's clear to everybody at the diocesan office and in the deanery and perhaps to some of the members of the congregation themselves that the church is really in free fall, then I get invited in to sort of start meeting with them, attending liturgy, coffee hour, going out for coffee, going out to meetings in the evenings and stuff like this. So it begins this time of prayer and pondering. And for us, it might take a year or two. With one exception, since I've been in this role, we've closed 17 churches and we've had a dozen churches in merger. And only in one setting did the bishop actually insist that something was to be done, and it became a publicity nightmare. And so we've learned. The downside is it takes a lot of time.
And people resources.
Right.
A lot of people
Yes,
resources.
right. What we have found is that the more I can be in prayer and pondering with people, I and the consultants, then after a while, because we hang around with them so much, they begin to see us as friends, not enemies, and they begin to see that human dimension of we're all on this journey together. And then once there begins to be some trust, we can then begin a very serious conversation about the particulars. But for the longest of time, it's just getting to know each other, helping them to explore issues. It's the lunchtime presentation really fed me, because I can't tell you how many times I've been in a situation having these having chats with folks, and they'll say, we just weren't ready. We had sent consultants in several years ago, and we had the same chats. But sometimes people are just not ready to hear what needs to be heard. And unfortunately, in too many cases in our diocese, when they're ready to hear, it's too late. We have 3 churches right now that we're working heavily and mightily with to revitalize them. We have another church that we're trying to repurpose, but it's not enough. And I just wish we could find that golden idea that we could begin in a chat and we could say something and it could really catch on. Unfortunately, when I'm invited into a chat, leaders are devastated, they're tired, they're worn down, there's no money, the roof is gone, the heating system is gone, you name it. There is nothing. And at that point, the right thing to do is to let the church die. Those people need to go through death. And it's incumbent upon us, from the diocesan perspective, staff and volunteers and others, to hold them, to cradle them, to provide a safe environment where they can go through that process. And then in time, God willing, realize one day that Good Friday is not the end, but that it is Easter. And I can tell you outside here wonderful resurrection stories where people have finally given it up and they've gone on to other congregations and they have found themselves and fallen in love with God again.
Something you said triggered something way back in my brain. A bunch of years ago, we looked at a series of successful interventions that we'd done, and we reverse engineered them. And we said, what did they have in common? And the thing that triggered, one of them was the fullness of time. The time was right. If the time's not right, it doesn't matter what you do. The other ones were authority. The ministry and work that's going on is supported and authorized by the diocese, the bishop, whatever. Skilled facilitation. contextualized resource. What you're doing has to make sense in the context you're in. And leadership, the right people with the right skills supporting and working on the team. And that's often local. And every one of these successful, often quite crazy interventions had those 5 things in common. But fullness of time is really something that we don't take into account. You know, we talk about it, when the door opens a crack, our job as diocesan staff is to stick our foot in the door so it doesn't close and start having the conversation.
You're saying that makes me also think, because I think you mentioned leadership. I
Yeah.
think one of the one of the particulars that has worked for us in our diocese is that though clergy are often involved in closings, for the most part, I as a layperson and a consultant as a layperson really get involved in the messiness of it. And so even though I'm on the diocesan staff, because I am talking with them as an equal, a layperson, because it's in most of these situations, by the time we're invited into the conversation, they have a very part-time clergy. And so it's really the officers and the members. And it really, I think, has been very helpful to not have this unbalanced chatting going on. I don't know, $25? I don't know. But I think that that's really, really important.
That meter is really ticking here. Man, I tell you. We have a hand up over here.
Scott Slater, colleague of Dan's. First comment, just for the record, since this is recorded, the Ascension Middle River situation is in litigation, and we have reached a tentative settlement. We're just working out the details. So,
Yay.
just for the record, in case that happens to reach any of those other people and inflame them enough to pull that. So, the second observation that you've made me think more about is that as I travel around our diocese, and I do Sunday visits on behalf of the bishops, and so I'm often confronted with the question, are we next? And what surprises me about that is not only how often that question is asked of me, because I also have more than Dan has the reputation of being the closer, because I'm typically the one who will show up and lock the door on the last service. But it's asked by congregations that I consider pretty doggone healthy and sustainable relative to the ones that we see that are not. And so there's a real fear out there. It's a genuine, palpable fear. And while I'm used to just saying, oh, you're in great shape, you know, I'm here to affirm that, and the bishop's very positive about you, but now I'm thinking, I'm almost dismissing an opportunity to have a lengthier chat.
So the question is, well, why do you think we would want to close you?
Well, no, and we talk about that, but I'm thinking it's almost a cry for help in a good way. Meaning, if they're already thinking about that, I don't want to shut down that conversation by telling them that they're great.
Right.
Even though that may be true, but if they're already asking themselves, what can we be doing strategically different than we're already doing? I don't want to shut down that conversation unnecessarily. $5. I want to figure out how we as a diocesan staff member can encourage that, encourage them to keep thinking that way.
It's an
'Cause
opportunity.
That's the opportunity that we really have, that we don't want to then have them end up 10 years from now in the state that it's going to take more work. It's actually it's a better investment of our time earlier on to put our energy into those congregations than to end up dealing with the ones that fall in our laps.
One of the other things that we've started, I think, to lick the problem on is parishes that you go into to lower the boom, and it's a surprise to them. Because no one's ever told the congregation that there's a problem. So we've got a lot more intentional around working with the whole congregation, around sharing with them their what we call performance data over the last 15 years. And for about 5 years now, all of our clergy have had an annual performance review with their area bishop. And there are goals, we're not holding the clergy responsible necessarily, but, if the parish is not cutting it, is not making it, that's an issue for the performance review of the clergy. Maybe we need to move them. You know, maybe we need to get them some more help. Maybe it's time to change the configuration of that ministry.
How do you enforce that?
It's mostly, it's not legalistic. It's not, it's very much bishop as pastor and kind of supervisor, but it's not an employment contract. You're not going to get terminated. We do have some other provisions where we've been able to move clergy, mostly in situations where parishes have failed to the point where they can't pay them. So we have a provision for non what do they call it? Yeah, whatever. You know, it's in non-disciplinary removal from office. But we also don't have tenure. We don't appoint rectors anymore. We appoint incumbents. We've been doing that for a generation. And so, I mean, really, the bishop is becoming, the area bishops are increasingly becoming seen as engaged in mission in those parishes as well. So it's a team. It's, you know, and we're not trying to do it to punish people. We're trying to do it to keep people from crashing and burning. But the big thing is, it shouldn't be a surprise. You know, the number of times I've heard wardens say, well, we didn't want to trouble people. We were afraid if we told them, you know, then they might stop coming altogether. They might stop, then where would we be? But where you are now.
We have about 10 minutes, and before we get, there's one more question I see, but one thing I wanted to point out, for those especially in any one of the original 13 colonies, it may be important for you to know what, if there are any state laws that affect you. I didn't know this until talking to Steve about, in Massachusetts, there are state laws that require a 2/3 majority vote of congregations to do things like close. So it's important for you to know your local your local state laws if there's anything.
This is just an observation, which was that I was reluctant to come to this workshop because I didn't want to be seen as the congregation possibly failing or the shame. But this has been very helpful because it's not about that. It's about something else emerging. But it's very interesting because I talked to somebody on the planning committee and they said, oh, but they're really great guys, and I know some of you guys. So, but it's very interesting to look at that because there is, I think, a feeling of failure or shame that's attached to this whole topic. As versus emerging and what are the needs and examining, you know, churches that have been in the same place, you know, geographically for 150 years and that's changed and all that. So that's very, very helpful.
Right. In Massachusetts, before we got into quote closing, merging, and then repurposing and revitalizing, when we went through an extensive process, which Deb will remember, where we came up with a document called Vitality and Viability. And it became very controversial. And there was a special convention, and it was the topic, and the hope was that the diocese was going to embrace this. Well, no such luck, because people saw it as, you're going to set up a system whereby you're going to start coming for us, you know, that these measurements are going to, in essence, give you the ammunition you need to plug us off, you know, as opposed to those of us who were engaged in pulling this thing together to say, no, it's not that at all. Its intent is just like you and I every year have a physical exam. Well, we just were not able to sell that. So the governing bodies and the bishops said, well, we're still going to use it. And for several years, whenever you had an Episcopal visit, you were given the document and there were a whole series of questions and you sort of went through it. So in Massachusetts, before we decided we were going to get it in closings and mergers, we said, it's really all about vitality and viability. I would love we have a new bishop. I don't know if I'm going to be there in another year or so, but if I am, I would love to have a day where I could say just what Dave said earlier, that, you know, they're in the proactive way with their congregations, that it's not about dealing with a church in a crisis, but it's building up the congregation. This should be all about feeding the local communities and feeding the world. It's the gospel, folks. We need to be about salvation. We need to be about empowering people just as Jesus did. And we keep getting sidetracked because roofs go, boilers go, leaders become harried and worn out. That's not what Jesus intended. So we've got to figure this out.
Bishop Sutton has said on more than one occasion, if your congregation is choosing the building over paying clergy, or building over feeding the hungry, or building over any kind of mission, then you're engaging in idolatry. And that's pretty strong, but it's true. When our buildings become an impediment to mission and ministry, we have sunk to a really, really new low.
I want to come back just real quick. Okay.
No, we've got 5 minutes. We have a question.
Sorry, I'm hearing the process of closing a church, and I'm a disciple. There's a process there, the grieving process. Is there follow-up for mergers? Because there's a whole lot of this and mine and yours and
Right.
and going into one building. What building do you choose? And do you follow up to make sure that you're able to meld all those?
You know that story about Solomon and the baby? It's a lot like that, actually. The parish, the new parish of Grace Church in Scarborough, which was a four-way amalgamation, they have this lovely little closet in the sacristy. You open up, there's 4 processional crosses. And so the crucifer goes in on Sunday morning and takes the cross that has the ribbon on it, and takes the ribbon and moves it to the next cross. So they're using them in rotation every Sunday. That stuff is all worked out. The care with which you treat the holy things of a congregation pay off in spades later on. So that church contains some marvelous modern stained glass that was in one of the original parishes. The Stations of the Cross from another of the parishes. You know, there are critical touchstones and pieces. Plus, when we close a building, deconsecrate a building, we remove things like the altar, the font, all that kind of stuff. Those are stored in a warehouse, and we use them in other churches. The material aspects of parishes are really important, when people see that, you know, the original altar from Church of the Epiphany is the altar we're using every Sunday, and it's been in constant use for 150 years. Sure, the building's new, and it's got plasma screens up on either side of it, you know, but it's still, that's important.
Mergers are very difficult. They are extremely difficult. They're even more painful than closings, believe it or not. And some of the reasons have to deal with the fact of all of those religious items which have so many memories, because you don't just have one church family, but you may have 2, 3, or 4 or 5 church families.
One of the critical pieces is the first rector of that new parish. I've been hounding the area bishop in the area where this vote is happening on Sundays. Phil, I sure hope you found us a magician, because you need one. They got to bring together. It's like marriage counseling, except there's not 2, there's 4.
Right.
You know, the potential is for problems is fraught. So someone who can bring together 4 cultures, 4 stories, and merge and make them something new. The guy that did Grace Church, that guy deserves a Purple Heart or something. I don't know. Nobody there will tell you, when you say, what church do you go to? They don't say St. George's or St. Crispin's. Or they say, I'm from Grace Church. They have their own. I went to Shrove Tuesday. My parish, for some reason, they're a bunch of heretics. They don't do Pancake Tuesday. So I went to Grace. And, I mean, they all know me there because I did all the work there. Got a big welcome. They do pancakes and samosas. because that's their culture. They're making their own traditions now, and their homemade samosas, and they are some good, I'll tell you.
We have time for one last question.
I just wanted to pick up on one thing that we had a minute ago. And one thing we haven't really talked about is the critical, important role of the diocese. And part of it is having the strategic vision, or the judicatory, and whatever the body is, to look at. I mean, we've done a lot of work on modeling demographic trends. And so we're looking now 15 years down the road and saying, what parishes are still going to be with us? Those are parishes we really need to be resourcing and investing in. Which ones aren't likely going to make it? We know we're going over a demographic cliff. It's nobody's fault. It's a fact. We're going to lose half of our people in the next 15 years. We're going to close half of our churches. Is the church going to continue? Damn straight. We're not going anywhere. We're going to look different. But, Jesus Christ is still going to be being proclaimed in our churches every Sunday, and hopefully other days of the week too.
I was fortunate enough to attend a consultation last month or 2 months ago, with Neil Harrison, who is on the church-wide staff of the ELCA. I see some nods back here. Neil is probably one of the most brilliant minds that I have met in a very long time. And the Lutherans have a great process in place to go through and to work with congregations and to assess the assets and strengths of the congregations. And so they have 5 congregations in a town where we have 1. And so they were involved, and just the way he so pastorally engaged the pastors and then the church councils it really taught me a lot. It really taught me a lot. And they've got this down pretty well. And so we can learn a lot from the ELCA churchwide about their whole assessment plan of looking at congregations. I'm feeling much more comfortable about this because other people have like Steve, have really broken the ice on some of this work, and I don't feel alone doing this anymore. And it's because of Steve and Neil Harrison and Dave and others that are doing this work, because there is new life. There is new life.
If you would like to get a copy electronically of the Diocesan of Massachusetts Eastern guidelines, we have guidelines for closings and mergers and checklists and things. We would be very happy to share them with you. I brought plenty of business cards, and all you gotta do is just email me, and I'm always willing to talk on the phone and stuff like that. Final comment. If you are engaged in this ministry, please make sure that you attend to self-care.
Yep.
It is crucial. You're going to get bounced around. You're going to get a lot of bruises. You're not going to be popular. And so it is really vitally important that you attend to your own care. Have a spiritual director, a spiritual mentor, have some people whom you can look to help you. Make sure you take time away, etc., etc. All ministry is difficult, and I'm not saying that it isn't. But if you are involved in closings and mergers and things like this, you really need to take care of yourself. And
That's it.
That's it.
Cool.
Thanks.
Thank you.